Hi everyone, it's Heather here from the Crispy Secretariat. Thanks everyone for coming along today. This is a new activity for Crispy, so very pleased to be kicking off with such a good topic. I think people we have on the line are largely directly involved in Crispy, so I won't go on about what we're aiming to achieve, but basically with these webinars we're trying to keep our partners abreast of new research or activities that are going on that might influence their research investments. Crispy's got over 20 partners who together manage a pretty significant investment relating to climate change research for primary industries. So pleased today that we're going to be hearing from Emma Hurd, who's the Executive Director of Emissions and Environment at Westpac. Emma will be talking to us about how financial institutions are factoring climate risk into policies and products that are focused on agriculture. She works across all areas of Westpac and is responsible for leading the bank's strategic response to climate change and for driving commercial solutions for emerging environmental challenges and opportunities. Emma is also the Director of the Carbon Market Institute Board and a member of the Cornerstone Capital Global Advisory Council. She's also the Chair of Technical Working Group 4, which is under the World Resources Institute and the UNEP Program Finance Initiative project, which is developing Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 guidance for financed emissions. Given all of that, she's clearly a very busy person, and we're very grateful for the time she's making available to Crispy to talk about this important issue. Just before I hand over to Emma, I just wanted to mention that you can ask questions at any stage during the webinar, and you just need to do that via the chat box you can see in the left-hand corner of your screen. It's a public chat box, so whatever you type in there will be available to everyone. And I think that's it for procedure stuff. There should be information in front of you have any technical dramas about getting into contact with Redback. So I'll hand over to Emma now, and she'll kick off with her presentation on managing climate risk.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the intro. I'm really going to spend about half an hour just talking through some of the ways in which we apply the kind of research that you guys are doing and how we use it from a financial institution perspective, but also how we think about climate risk and carbon risk more broadly. And what we're seeing and what we're hearing in terms of talking to businesses and to our customers across the whole range of industry sectors, but also how we integrate it into our own policies, practices and systems. And then at the end, I just want to quickly throw out a few thoughts as well around the kind of things that we look for that you guys would also potentially participate in or contribute to. I'm not driving my slides, so every few seconds I'm going to be saying next slide. But if you have questions along the way, then feel free to pop it into the chat box and I'll answer them as we go. Or you can hang on to them to the end, but it's probably quicker just to pop them in there and I can and where I can see them and I can just answer them as we go through. Next slide, please. I think, as I said, this is a fairly complicated topic, and there are lots of different ways to come into this subject matter. The way that financial institutions sort of start in this particular topic is to acknowledge right from the get-go that we are by no stretch of the imagination experts in climate science. We are definitely not experts in terms of understanding how it's evolving, what the scientific underpinnings are. Suffice to say that we recognise the fact that there are a lot of people out there who are experts, and we accept their opinion and we accept what the science is telling us around what's likely to happen, and we rely upon it in the same way that we use it in all sorts of other areas around forecasting or predictions or industry trends or underlying performance metrics. We give it the exact same level of confidence. Next slide, thanks. Having said that, given it's such a complicated area, I'm only going to bite off one small piece of the whole agenda. Just talking about it very much from a risk perspective, how we think about it, how we look at it, and how we break it down into more manageable pieces, and then also how we try and flip it into innovation, because everything that financial institutions do is about using financial expertise to reduce risk, to reduce exposure, and different sorts of products and services that we can apply to that. Next slide, please. So increasingly what we're seeing in terms of how business thinks about these sorts of mega trends or mega risks, as they're often called, just to make it sound a little bit more dramatic, is in the context of a whole range of external risk factors which impact your operating environment. And this is actually a really interesting report that comes out annually at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland at the beginning of the year, which is a very substantive survey of CEOs and CFOs and business leaders and industry heads around what they see as the major risks impacting their operating environment. And I think what's also always really interesting about this report is the prevalence of environmental risk in this risk landscape. This is not just about environmental risk. This is every risk that business sees impacting its operations. And the blue and the green ones are social and environmental risks in particular. And I think, this is also self-identifying likelihood and impact. And if you go on to the next slide as well, then you can see how this landscape has changed and intensified over time in terms of how business is proactively identifying and managing these risks. So that top box of risks runs from 2007 to 2014, and it's ranking the top 5 risks in terms of likelihood, and it's colour-coded to match the different sort of buckets of risks. And green is environmental, blue is economic, orange is social. The grid's down the bottom. The second set of boxes is the impact, top 5 risks in terms of impact over the same period. And I think you can just, 2007 is an interesting starting point because it's essentially when we peaked on the GFC, or when we hit peak GFC, I guess you could say, and everything since then has been post-GFC. And you can see the dominance of the economic issues as those significant macro issues over the first few years. But then what you quickly see is the re-emergence of the greens and the environmental risks. And this is business risks. These are not societal risks. This is identifying top 5 risks with likelihood to have a significant impact on your business at the World Economic Forum, not renowned for being a bunch of hippies. So I think this is a really interesting sort of indication of how business is thinking about climate risk more broadly. Next slide, please. I think what we're also seeing is that along the same lines is that there is increasing convergence between what have traditionally been relatively separate buckets of risk. It's increasingly difficult to separate out carbon risk from energy security, from water risk, from issues around the impact of increasing industrialisation of the developing world, to the impact on resource constraints of population growth, to the emergence of a high-consuming middle class in the Asia region, and what that means for resource consumption and emissions growth. All of these issues are now so symbiotic that it's increasingly hard to have a sort of separate line of attack or a separate strategy around them. And this is kind of an emerging area which I think is happening really rapidly. It certainly happened in the last couple of years, but this year in 2014 in particular, I think we've seen a significant acceleration of this trend, this convergence around economic and environmental and social risks. And I won't go through this in detail, but I would just point you towards that last one, and I think that there's been a lot of media coverage around this question around what China's going to do, well, what America's going to do, but also what China's going to do around pollution control. And it's interesting that you see a lot of the regulation around pollution control now feeding into and to some extent shaping climate change policy. You also see a lot of the economic development imperative in the US and the increased export of gas shaping environmental agenda and the climate change agenda. But you also see issues of social equity and sort of underlying commodity market impacts as well. One of the interesting sort of metrics that the commodities trading guys often look at is, the protein effect. The wealthier a society gets, the more meat they eat. And of course, the flip side of that is the more meat they eat, the more land they use, the more water they consume. and then all of the additional and broader environmental impacts of that, and more land clearing, more emissions. All these issues are very cyclical, very interrelated. It's hard to have an effective response to one without the other. So I think what you're seeing is, I guess what I'm pointing to here is not to sort of, paint this picture of ridiculous complexity, but rather to point towards increasing consolidation in the way that financial markets understand the integrated impacts of these risks, in the same way that they do in oil markets, commodity markets, FX and currency markets. It's all about understanding how these things play out against each other. Next slide, please. Part of that is, recognition of the risk, but the other side of that is determining what's the best way to respond. What's the best way to respond for your business, for your operations, in your region, relative to your peers within your industry sector, and subject to the regulations of your key operating jurisdictions. And I think a lot of what we're seeing, particularly in the volatility of the climate change debate over the last couple of years, and the role of business in that, which hasn't always showered itself in glory, shall we say, is that there's a lot of still sorting through all of those impacts to work out how to respond, how to best to respond, and over what time period, and how to balance all these different sorts of competing priorities and interconnected impacts. And what we're seeing is that there is this increasing consolidation around a few key themes. One, it's an impact in terms of that risk landscape I was talking about. Second, that it's all about managing potential outcomes and variabilities. Third, that it's about understanding and really getting your head around the interconnectedness between these different sorts of pressure points. And what we're seeing emerging is the way to do that is to invest in and to frame your response around resilience. The good old-fashioned, almost old-fashioned sort of theory of resilience is having somewhat of a renaissance in the fact that it provides a really useful framework for understanding how to sort of future-proof your business in a lot of ways. So it's interesting the language has evolved again. Next slide, thanks. So that's kind of like the big picture context in which I wanted to frame my specific comments and talk about what Westpac's actually doing, because I think that understanding that landscape is really important. There are so many, as I said, so many bits and pieces to the climate change debate that I really want to go into a process of winnowing it down from the big to the more focused. And that big risk landscape, that big sort of operating environment picture is really important because it helps you to interpret why business does what it does and how it thinks about things and how it's looking to get its hands around this huge, complex and messy ball of string, which is climate change. So for Westpac, we probably first published a comprehensive position statement and a strategy for how we were going to respond to it in 2008. And we've actually conveniently just last week released a progress report on how we've gone against that position statement. And that was actually the first time, and as far as we're aware, we were one of the first banks to actually put down in paper and go get it signed off by the CEO and the board to actually say, this is what we think the impacts of climate change are for our industry and this is how we're going to respond. And we didn't necessarily do everything that we said we were going to do over the 5 years because the debate moved on quite quickly. But what we did do was identify the key areas of activity around building capacity and understanding carbon risk or climate risk as a part of that, products and services to help our customers, engaging our employees, community engagement and advocacy, and managing our own footprint. And those 5 key themes have formed the bedrock of our response literally over one of what you could say was one of the most turbulent public policy periods and issues from 2007 or 8 to 2013. We're going through a process of refreshing that at the moment, and all of those themes I talked about in terms of convergence and risk management and increasing sophistication in understanding the micro impact are all feeding into that. We're also kind of coming out of the heavy dependence on public policy and focusing more on what are the measures that business can be taking which are resilient to variability, not just in the climate, but also in the climate policy debate. Next slide, thanks. So a big part of that is understanding how climate change is going to impact our business. And when we think about carbon risk for Westpac, for our operations, it's also important to remember that we're an extremely large corporation. So we have 36,000 employees. We have around 650 commercial properties, retail network, about 8 significant data centres, really large data centres and call centres, 12 million customers, and a large physical footprint. We're also frequently considered an essential service in times of disaster, when significant events occur at the community level. Having the ability for the local branch to distribute cash, emergency cash supplies to local communities is incredibly important, and having the ability to play that local community enabling role in getting communities back on their feet after large disasters is also incredibly important. We're also exposed to all of the impacts that our customers face from a credit risk perspective, but also an insurance risk perspective, as we have a large insurance business as well through BT Financial Group. So, whether it's Westpac or St George or Bank of Melbourne or Bank SA or RAMS or BT Insurance or Westpac Institutional Bank, we're exposed to the secondary impacts of climate risk all over the place. So I'm not going to talk about the whole spread of them. I'm really going to zero in on this credit risk question, and in terms of how it feeds into how we assess climate risk and carbon risk specifically in our credit risk assessment policies, processes and practices. Next slide, thanks. So, everybody has slightly different language, and because this is an evolving area, I always think it's really important to specify what we mean when we say carbon risk, because they're all slightly different, but kind of the same in terms of the terminology that institutions and different stakeholders use. So when we talk about carbon risk, we think of it as having a number of different dimensions, and we actually look at a number of different dimensions. We look at the regulatory risk impacts, we look at the physical risk impacts, we look at the market and competitive risk implications of those physical and regulatory risk dimensions, and we also look at reputational risk. And this is really significant, because increasingly what we're seeing is, whereas traditionally it was around potential gap between claims around performance and actual performance, greenwashing, that kind of thing. Increasingly, it's around community expectations of corporate behaviour and what the community expects business and industry to be doing around these sorts of issues. And in a lot of ways, I think you have this almost uneven balance that goes on between regulation and community expectation, and it swings back and forth. But either way, community expectation and reputational risk is always an excellent lead indicator for regulatory risk. Generally, we tend to find physical risk. I would say out of all of these, physical risk is, or climate risk, as it's often called, is the hardest and still the most underdeveloped. I think the release of the latest IPCC reports will help that. There's having a whole new, fresh tranche of detail. It's feeding into a lot of different processes, but it's also incredibly important that you translate those global research reports and findings into incredibly local data points, particularly from our perspective, and particularly if we're looking at, say, primary industries or rural industries. Local context is so significant in terms of actual climate risk. Global context is important for regulatory, market and competitive and reputation, how those big impacts translate at a very local level. So that's, we tend to break down carbon risk into those different dimensions, and they're more or less material depending upon which industry you're looking at, the size of the deal or the customer, the level of detail of risk assessment or due diligence to which you're going. Next slide, thanks. So this is our actual risk assessment process as cut from our credit manual, actually the Institutional Banking Credit Manual. This flow diagram is straight cut and paste. And it talks about how we look at carbon risk in the context of our environment, social and governance risk parameters, or ESG risk as the banks like to call it. The ESG risk is shorthand for all of those externalities or external factors which have not been captured by traditional financial risk metrics. But increasingly, going back to my theme around convergence, what we're seeing is the desire to rationalise these frameworks down into single sorts of process frameworks which allow you to assess the individual risk components. And climate risk or carbon risk is within the E of the ESG, which is in just the credit risk process. So this flow diagram is the process that we undertake when looking at large corporate transactions, going through the process of when the deal or potential deal is identified, when we look at the evaluation of the specific inputs and outputs of the particular project or transaction, going through the internal approval processes, which, as you can imagine, for a financial institution are quite significant, how we put the documentation around it and the settlement process, ongoing monitoring of the performance of the particular asset or the transaction, any kind of parameters for problem management should unforeseen circumstances arise or issues arise, and then looping back around again to potential refinancing or origination of a new opportunity. So in each stage of this credit risk assessment process, we look at ESG risk and ESG risk factors, and that includes carbon risk. And to talk about how this works in a particular large asset, for example, we could be looking at dealing with a company that's looking to borrow money from us, for example, to put in place or to replace their refrigeration facilities, or to look at replacing their trucking fleet, for example. And at that point, we'll look at what the drivers are for undertaking that in the first place. And one of those drivers, for example, might be, if it's a new refrigeration facility, it might be the increased cost of refrigerative gases as a result of regulatory frameworks, or it might be, if it's physical risk issues, it might be the fact that the equipment has reached its end of life sooner rather than it would have otherwise because of increased demands, because of increased peaking temperatures with longer heat waves, or less cooler nights, or just higher average temperatures, for example, which means that the demand pressures on the refrigeration system were higher than they were, so therefore they're replacing it earlier than they would normally. We would look at what type of system they're replacing it with. How resilient will that system be to those ongoing and changing weather conditions in terms of, say, for example, food storage or food movement. We would look at what other sorts of regulatory changes are likely to happen around those particular refrigerant gases or inputs such as energy costs in particular, electricity and gas price increases. And they might be looking at different sorts of opportunities for distributed energy generation to facilitate, like solar panels on the roof of the refrigerant warehouse, for example, and doing it in a more integrated way. We'd also look at, in terms of documentation, we'd look at, particularly at the moment, in terms of carbon cost pass-through, we'd look at ensuring there's sufficient flexibility in there around managing the variability of those regulatory requirements. We'd also look at ability to upscale or to downscale depending upon increase in volatility in weather conditions. Essentially all the things that we're looking for are, have you understood your risks? What information sources are you accessing? What's your level of expertise and capability to manage this on an ongoing basis? Why are you doing what you're doing? And how predictable or confident are you around the cash flow impacts and your ability to repay it over time based on proactive and effective management of those variables or those risks. So we do it at every part of the process is I guess what I'm saying. Next slide, thanks. Yeah, so look, as I said, increasingly what we're finding is that the challenges, particularly with physical risk, climate risk, well, actually with regulatory risk as well, for that matter, is the it isn't a smooth ramp up, or there isn't a smooth trajectory that we can rely upon. There is increasing certainty around the likely direction of a lot of impacts, but not necessarily the speed or rate or localised impacts. So increasingly what we look for by way of effective risk mitigation to these sorts of emerging areas is flexibility, significant efficiency gains, because that has other sorts of benefits as well, productivity improvements. So if you can but also sustainable productivity improvements. So it has to be, it can't just be like awesomely productive and efficient this year, and then in 3 years or 5 years' time, you have to replace the whole system, or you have to rejig your whole property because you failed to manage over a longer period of time. So what we're really looking for in terms of positive investments is activities which generate significant co-benefits, so either water efficiency or energy efficiency gains as well, or greater yields or more stability about cropping yields over time, for example. We also look for deals that are not relying upon short-term government grants unless it's for a bit of a boost. If it's dependent upon that government grant or subsidy, then we tend to take a slightly dimmer view just because it's not as reliable as it used to be. We look at whether it's in terms of improvement of soil quality or improving the resilience of the property to increasing variability in weather conditions. We look at if it saves money. We always look at that, to be honest. But yeah, it's really just that focus on, are you taking a balanced approach? Will you be able to adjust flexibly over time? Are the measures that you're taking increasing the resilience of your operations to increasing unpredictability and variability? But are you doing it in such a way that it's slow, steady, incremental improvements over time that will continue to yield benefits? And I mean, obviously, this is a function of the investment return period that we're looking at. But generally, we look much more favourably on balanced decisions rather than short-term cash grabs or short-term measures which have significant financial returns in 1 year but then don't deliver over a longer period of time. Next slide, thanks. So, I mean, of course, what we also see is the ongoing push for innovation as well. And I actually think that, like, Australian industry in this sector is some of the best in the world in terms of turning risk and adversity into opportunity. That's partly because of necessity, because of, as a country and in terms of the industries have always had to deal with these sorts of factors in terms of the ongoing need for efficiency and resilience to extreme weather conditions, for example. But I also think there's increasing recognition globally of the technological and process or farm-based work, innovation that's been done within Australia to really get more sustainable and productive outcomes out of systems and processes. So that just that skill set in terms of resource management is incredibly important. I think we've also seen with the carbon farming initiative, I think that's a big area of opportunity in terms of getting additional funding through the government, either via the current and existing carbon price mechanism or carbon tax, as it's somewhat incorrectly referred to, but also even under the emissions reduction fund, which will replace it. Carbon farming initiative still has an important role there in terms of delivering abatement into other parts of the economy, and a lot of it has to date come from regional or rural industries. It hasn't really come from heavy industry, apart from potentially waste management a bit. So I think that will continue to be an important source of funding and opportunity for the sector. The last one there, I mean, a lot of people like talking about the dining boom, mainly because I think they like saying the dining boom because it's a pretty nifty expression. But I think for me it's not just about growing and shipping and producing more and more and more. I actually think it's around understanding that nexus between population growth, around increasing emergence of the middle class demanding more protein, around understanding the impact of developing countries such as China, where they just refuse to eat food grown in their own country because of pollution concerns and impacts, and what that's going to do for the premium of Australian exports, particularly in the food sector. I think the carrying capacity issues, exporting more and more and more, but it might be a function of being able to charge more and get into more markets in terms of what we are growing and exporting because of that quality premium, because of being able to prove the environmental co-benefits of the produce which is being exported. So I tend to think of the dining boom is one of premium. It's a story of premium, more than necessarily a story of volume growth. But I'd actually be more interested in everybody else's opinion on that as well. So what does that mean for financial institutions? Well, this question that we constantly struggle with in this space, because it's such a multifaceted issue, is does this mean that we should be creating a whole new suite of products and services to address these emerging needs? Or does it actually become a question of looking at what products and services we already provide and ensuring that they accommodate and fund and support activities being undertaken for new reasons to manage carbon risk, to pursue new areas of opportunity coming out of the changing macro environment around environmental risk. And it's a question that it doesn't necessarily have a right or wrong answer. We tend to look at it on an ongoing basis, depending upon the industry sector, the customer, the product type. I mean, in some cases, we've actually come up with a whole new product, and in other cases, we've actually just said, no, we just need to slightly adjust our underwriting standards to accommodate different sorts of drivers and risk factors. And to give you an example of that, in asset finance, we came up with a whole new product for energy efficiency equipment finance because we found there were particular structural issues in energy efficiency projects which weren't met by existing products and services in that space. Usually the fact that energy efficiency projects have a longer payback period, so 7 to 10 years, but also they usually consist of a whole range of small fiddly activities where you get the maximum value out of it rather than one big whopping piece of the kit that you can install. So we restructured a product slightly or came up with something new in that space which accommodated these slightly different requirements than what you would traditionally get with equipment finance products. On the other side, in the ag sector, for example, we've integrated carbon risk impacts, particularly coming out of the carbon farming initiative, in terms of underlying finance assessments. We haven't thought to come up with a special like CFI finance product because we actually wanted to see it more integrated into the ongoing operation of the property or the facility or the site rather than being a standalone piece of work just because of that question around ongoing financial sustainability. Next slide, thanks. These are ongoing questions that we continue to look at, and I'm keeping it at a reasonably high level, but it is an issue which we continue to work through piece by piece and then circle back around again and look at other areas of opportunities to see how the debate has moved on. And one of the ways we try and keep pushing the agenda forward as well is through participating in a lot of cross-industry collaborations, different sorts of initiatives. And I just picked out 3 here because I thought they would be more relevant to this conversation. So the Banking Environment Initiative is actually quite a new one. It's really only kicked off in a major way last year and has launched a number of initiatives this year. And it's a collaboration between banks and their customers, looking at particular industry sectors around how to address some of the environmental sustainability issues jointly. So commodities and commodity trade finance is one big area of focus, and that recognises the fact that banks and consumables companies are joint participants in projects which are exposed to potentially significant environmental, social and governance risks, particularly in developing economies, and that often different parts of the supply chain will try and evade the scrutiny of either financial institutions in terms of their ESG risk processes or the consumable companies themselves in terms of locally outsourced project managers and find the loopholes and get around the provisions that big companies like us are trying to put in place. So we kind of came to the conclusion that where's the main point of intervention where we can have the most effect. And so we've developed this initiative called the Sustainable Shipment Letter of Credit. So letter of credit for shipping of commodities is one of those kind of tools of the trade. You can't move a commodity from one market to the other without one of these things. So if you pick that as a point of intervention and basically say you can't get it unless you can demonstrate with evidence that you've managed the environment and sustainability implications of your project, then it tends to have that kind of ripple effect in a much more substantive way. And there's a lot more interesting stuff coming out of the BEI. I would definitely recommend going in there and having a look. The Equator Principles is probably the more famous one for banks. If you've been following specifically to project finance, it's a voluntary initiative for banks to apply a whole extra layer of due diligence around environment and social risk. It was initially started by 10 banks globally, including Westpac, and now covers around 75% of global total project finance. And it's all voluntary. There's no regulation underpinning it. And it's basically based on the premise that banks have that if you effectively manage environment and social risk, you're more likely to have improved financial risk outcomes as well. And that last one down the bottom, I think, was mentioned in my intro, the World Resources Institute, the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development all working together to come up with a reporting framework for financed emissions, which is essentially the carbon risk embedded in the portfolios of financial institutions, which is a really interesting and exciting area, and incredibly bloody hard, to be honest, as well. I think this project will take the full 2 years that they've allocated, because it's a huge undertaking and quite a complex piece of work. Also, conveniently, when I went in there to grab the screenshot of their page, I noticed that they've just put out a new reporting framework for agricultural emissions, which I thought might also be of interest to this group. These guys kind of developed the first basic standard for reporting that everybody used for industry, even though now it's a lot more tailored to the domestic jurisdictions based on mandatory or regulatory reporting requirements. It's still kind of the global generic standard. So it's significant that these guys are doing this work around financed emissions. So we participate in these things because this is, if you sit back and wait for regulation, or sit back and wait for industry consensus about what will happen, then you're not in a super competitive position. You're not proactively managing the risks. And particularly for financial institutions, you know, we have customers at all points of the spectrum. We have some who won't do anything until they absolutely have to. And we have others who are driving global best practice out of Australia or New Zealand. So we need to understand all points of the spectrum and in between. So it's a slightly unique role that financial institutions play. But also, from our own perspective, we think we get better returns, more sustainable returns, and we're a stronger business if we're actively managing carbon risk and these sorts of issues. Next slide, thanks. Industries or agricultural sector. That point that I was making around there is no one answer, there is no one neat solution. It's hard to see the way forward. Unfortunately, the expectation is it'll be messy. So you won't have a nice, smooth, clean transition. You'll have all sorts of mini transitions going on at different levels of the economy and the community. And this is a framework which came out of the NCARF work a few years ago, which I think we've always found really useful in terms of understanding the different points of change and transition across the industry, in terms of how we think about it as well from a risk perspective. We look at it in terms of what's going on at the property level, what's going on in the industry level, and then what's going on at the geographical level, because in so many regional or agricultural industries, geography is just as important as the industry. So understanding those sorts of movements and how they're tracking and what's going on at different points and different places is what we consider to be a really useful framework for thinking about it. Having said that, I mean, there is so much work to do in this space. There is so much more to understand, and there's so much work in particular that needs to happen in terms of translating that global science, the global research into the local impact. Because when it comes down to it, when we make a credit transaction decision at a very basic level, we want the information to be as real and as local as possible. So it's very difficult for us, and we're very reluctant to take these global trends and global data points and try and translate them into local impacts, because it's just not how it works. So we look to them for reference, but at this point it'd be fair to say that we're still waiting for that really comprehensive data set that we can apply and that we can build into our normal credit systems and processes for primary industries in particular, at a much more local level. And it won't be a single data set. We know that it'll come in different points. It'll come in terms of the impact of underlying land valuation that we use for security. It will come in the form of weather modelling used for predicting cropping yields. It'll come in the weather models used for impacting the probability of extreme weather events and what the likelihood of that is occurring in any particular season. Input costs for dairy production, for example, in terms of energy or gas costs, shipping costs, transportation costs, visibility over it, get that capacity up, get that understanding of it. I think that's my last slide. I think that's my second last or last slide, apart from my rather pithy disclaimer. There it is. Who says the carbon isn't regulated in Australia? So I might leave it there. I haven't seen any questions as I've been going through. So I might just open it up now to see if anybody wants to bounce back to one of those earlier points that was made, or dive in a bit more deeply on some of those particular aspects that I've talked about. But really, really what I've just tried to do here, I recognise that I'm coming quite a different perspective to often what you're looking at and what you're working with. But I guess what I've tried to show you is a bit of a window into how our customers and our business is looking at climate risk. We look at it in a macro global perspective as a long-term megatrend or risk impact. We look at it at the industry level, customer level, the transaction level. We've had to come up with whole new frameworks for defining it and understanding it. We're still coming up with new frameworks for measuring the quality of the response or how effective that response is. And so as an interim measure, really what we're looking for all the way through is that function of resilience and flexibility. Around opportunities for land sector abatement under the ERF. So we'll start with the easy questions then, obviously. The ERF is still evolving. I think that from the engagement that we've had with the government, there is a significant appetite to ensure the ongoing survival of the project development businesses which have emerged under the carbon price mechanism. And they appear to be very conscious of the need to provide that source of income support for ACCU abatement purchasing as well. The challenge will be in terms of where they fix the price point or the benchmark price relative to other types of abatement. And I think one of the challenges in trying to mix together lots of different methodologies is that they all have different abatement prices. And so it'll come down to a function of the competitiveness of land sector abatement versus other new emerging forms of activity or energy efficiency activities, for example. So that's kind of still evolving. And also the impact of the safeguard mechanism as well, and what kind of liabilities that creates, because I think that will be, in the medium term, probably also a significant area of opportunity for further ACCU generation and sale into the market, because I know that they are looking at having the ability to use carbon credits generated under the ERF as a make good provision on contracts, for example, which will hopefully facilitate a secondary market as well from our perspective. So not a very clear answer, I'm afraid, but I know that the government's trying to make sure that the land sector stays in the scheme. It'll be full supply for credits generated from the land sector as well. Any other questions? I'll pause and take a drink of water.
I think you might have another question coming through, Emma, from Kathy, what I can see from a flashing light on the screen. So maybe I have another sip and we'll see if... No, perhaps not. Press the backspace button. So, any more questions to come in? Oh, here we go. Do you see yeah, it's... Might just read the question out to the few people listening in online who don't have the screen. So, Kathy sent in a question about, you mentioned you're looking for flexibility and resilience. Do you regard some sectors as being more resilient than others, or is it assessed at a business level?
Generally, we do look at it at a business level, but having said that, either because the nature of the business that they're in demands them to be. So, for example, if you're looking at primary industries versus car manufacturing, for example, but also But also, I think it's very much a function of industry and competitive pressures as well. So some industry sectors just have incredibly tight profit margins, and they just require that relentless focus on efficiency and productivity all the time. And I think those companies who are used, and also industries that are more exposed to international markets, also tend to be more flexible as well, because they've usually just had to become so. In terms of responding to variability in price movements or new forms of competition coming online. There's the constant pressure to be as efficient and productive as possible. And I think that's part of what I was saying before about a lot of primary industries in Australia being some of the most competitive in the world for that reason. And it's interesting when you benchmark emissions intensity of different industry sectors. As a result, you get some outperforming Australian and New Zealand companies as well. I think it was a famous study I saw a few years ago that was looking at the emissions intensity from a life cycle perspective of shipping a kilo of lamb from a farm in Wales to us. It was actually the lamb from New Zealand, even with shipping and transportation emissions, was still more greenhouse gas efficient than the lamb from Wales. And I generally think that that's a function of the fact of just having to be internationally competitive as forced those sorts of adaptations as well. But to answer your question specifically, we always look at it at a business level, but industry-wide factors will count. And just Jason, who asked the previous question around opportunities for land sector abatement, has also just made the observation that he also thinks there will be some challenges in terms of identifying truly additional abatement, particularly from energy and other industry sectors. I would agree with you on that one. And the methodology development, I think, will be significant there as well, and what kind of governance frameworks they put around methodology approvals. To be a little controversial, occasionally the emissions reduction fund tends to be adapted to meet the requirements of different points in the political cycle. So really, when it comes down to it, you always have to look at the absolute detail in terms of how it will function, where the money will come from over what period of time, what methodologies will get approved, and the specific commercial arrangements underpinning it, just to get a sense of how accessible and functional and practical it will be. And just another question, is Westpac factoring in a true carbon price over the longer term, i.e. more than 5 years? Depends what you mean by true carbon price, but for particular industry sectors, we were factoring in a carbon price before the scheme came in Australia, and we'll continue to factor it in after the repeal of the carbon price, because it's a risk variable. So from a regulatory risk perspective, the possibility of being reintroduced remains. So therefore, we will continue to price it in. One of the other types of price on carbon, which is often discussed, which doesn't exist in Australia, which does exist in a number of other jurisdictions, is also the social cost of carbon, which is the cost of the impact of climate change. And I think that's an area which will emerge as well, not just the regulated price of emitting, but also the cost impact of adapting, which is a slightly different way of looking at a price on carbon. It's in place in America. It has been for a number of years, actually. In fact, the Obama administration quietly doubled it last year. And it exists in the UK and a number of other jurisdictions as well. So I think that's another area where different types of prices on carbon will remain. But to answer your question specifically, yes, we do for particularly impacted industry sectors. But without the regulation, we might reduce the scope of the industry sectors that we apply the hard carbon price to. Any other questions from anyone else? Or have I overwhelmed you?
Oh, sorry, one more just coming from Jason.
Yes, no, Jason's just confirming he did mean a market-based carbon price, yes.
Oh, well, I think I can't see any more signals of people typing, so is there anything you wanted to say by way of wrap-up before I wrap up there, Emma?
No, thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak. It's actually an area where I'm very interested in, and I think I mentioned before that we're refreshing our climate change position statement at the moment, and that will have a new action plan that will run over the next 3 years, so out to 2017. And we picked 2017 because all of our strategies run to that date at the moment, because that's when Westpac turns 200 years old, so everything's geared around what kind of company we want to look like in that year. But one of the big areas of focus that we will be having under that new strategy is around resilience and adaptation, and just really kind of pushing improved understanding of the impacts of climate change, as well as the mitigation requirements. So that's an exciting area, which I think will be very relevant for this forum as well.
All right. Well, yes, thank you. You certainly haven't overwhelmed us with you sounded rather cynical there in the thrilling world of the financial institutions. That was
I always got my disclaimer in front of me.
Yeah, that was really interesting, and I think was something our partners were definitely looking for, and many of things that we hear in our crispy conversations about translating from the global science to the local level. Everyone seems to be looking for that, but also looking at capacity to manage risk, and also resilience in terms of risk mitigation. The other thing I thought that was quite interesting is that collaboration is the word everywhere, and that that's occurring at the financial institution level about how to deal with climate risk. So yeah, that was really very interesting, and thank you very much for your time, Emma. If anyone has anything that they would like us to follow up on, just shoot me an email and we'll do that. But thanks again, everyone, for coming along, and thank you, Emma.
No worries. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks to Heather and Sarah for organising, and Laura for running the webinar as well.